Hello, folks. I want to talk a little bit tonight about self-care. It's something I've been thinking about a lot since being back from my trip with my mom. And so, one of the things that I've been noticing for myself and talking to my housemate about is, noticing that sometimes what I call self-care is not actually self-loving. And so, I'm thinking I'm probably not the only one who does this. So I've noticed that, I tend to frame those times when I let myself off the hook and go easy with myself. I tend to think of those as self care. Those times when I step back from experiences that I know will make me really uncomfortable and require me to face my fears and my resistance and my self limiting beliefs. And so I tell myself that I'm being nice to myself, that I'm taking care of myself rather than naming what it really is, which is fear and discomfort. And so every time that I step back from that fear and discomfort, rather than face it, then it actually has more of a hold on me. And over time, it becomes harder and harder to then be able to face it and to be able to imagine myself being on the other side of it. And so, while we definitely do need balance in our lives and that we are meant to have times of inner challenge and intensity and times of rest and ease, then, when I avoid the things that make me feel uncomfortable, it is not actually self loving. What I'm actually doing is allowing myself to stay stuck, which actually creates more pain and suffering for me. And the more self loving thing for me to do would actually be to face whatever it is that I actually don't want to face. And so, we all have a ceiling that is based on our self limiting beliefs. And so when we get near our ceiling, then it is very stormy. There are sensations of dread in our body. We have memories of hurt and rejection that come up. We have feelings of inadequacy and self doubt. And it can be very tumultuous, for sure. And so it makes sense that we would think that loving ourselves means staying away from all of that storminess. And the higher that we go in life, then the more intense the barrier. And so the more energy that is required to be able to bust through it. And so you can think about when you fly in a plane, for instance. So the energy that is required to get off the ground, is much stronger than the energy that is required to stay up in the air once you are up. And so when you are busting through the clouds, then there can be a lot of scary turbulence. And if you are in a rocket, then the energy that is required to bust through the barrier of the Earth's gravitational force is even more extreme and scary and bumpy. And so I can't really speak to the experience of astronauts, but flying in a plane, once you break through and are above the clouds, then it is quiet and peaceful for the most part, which you would never really guess just moments before when you were in the middle of the turbulence. And so the turbulence is usually pretty short-lived, um, but it can be scary and intense. And so just imagine if every time we flew, that we became alarmed every time that we encountered turbulence. And instead of bursting through it, then we took it as a sign that we aren't meant to fly and we went back down to the ground. So we would never even know that the turbulence is usually just a temporary barrier and that on the other side of it is the quiet freedom of flight. And so, we all have our own gravitational force of self limiting beliefs that keep us within the realm of the known and the familiar, the things that we tell ourselves about what is possible for us. And it keeps us exactly where we are unless we strongly push through it. And so it takes a lot of energy and effort to be born. So you can think about the chick that is pecking its way out of the shell. It really requires some effort to peck out of the shell. It doesn't necessarily, it's not a passive process. And so, the shell can keep us safe and protected and nurtured for a time. But if we stay in the shell beyond the appropriate time, then Maybe because we're afraid of the intense stimulus of the world outside, or we can't really summon the energy or the determination to be able to peck through the shell. Then the shell can become a toxic prison for us that can cause us to slowly die. And so, it can be really confusing because, those inner voices, they sound so sincere and they sound so rational and reasonable. Yes, I've had a hard day. I deserve to chill out and smoke a bowl and watch hours of Netflix, take it easy on myself. Life is hard enough being trans, so let me just, enjoy the moments of calm rather than kind of inviting further challenge. Um, Maybe I'm not feeling up to it today, and so I'm just going to take care of myself and not push myself. And at first, then maybe it does feel great, but those tend to have diminishing returns. And so the first hour of Netflix might feel great. The second hour you might start to notice a little restlessness, or kind of a nagging voice that you kind of be like, Shh, I'm having fun, leave me alone. And then, by the third, fourth hour, you might start to notice kind of an underlying terror about now the prospect of turning off Netflix. And so, the way to evaluate whether something is truly self-care or not, a lot is, kind of how we feel afterward. So most of us can probably identify with, the experience of really dreading going to the gym. And then, once we're there and we're actually doing it, then we come home, then we actually feel really terrific about ourselves, even if we might feel physically a little bit exhausted or sore. And, also we probably, many of us have had the experience of the kind of mind-numbing toxicity that comes from, like 6 straight hours of Netflix. So, when trauma gets kicked up, which, is kind of what happened to me when I was in California, we tend to want to hang on to something that feels familiar and safe. That for me, as I shared in my video about dealing with trauma, was really around food and around TV. And so, we want to create that kind of bubble of self-protection around us when the world doesn't feel safe. And what I found is that bubble actually usually just cuts us off from the things that could actually help us to move forward. That the things that would really allow us to thrive rather than just continuing to survive another day. And so, for me, then while watching a movie, once a month or once a week might be authentically self-nurturing. If I'm doing that every night, then there's likely something that I'm trying to avoid. And so for me, writing my book really required me to face and to confront just a lot of painful things inside of myself. So the part of me that wanted to run and hide and quit, every time that I couldn't really get into the flow of writing. Part of me that was afraid of revealing myself and facing the scrutiny and judgment from putting myself out there. Um, all the emotional pain of revisiting my partner falling in love with somebody else and ultimately leaving me. And so it took, kind of immense courage and determination every day to face all of that discomfort, to stick with it, to be able to complete my book draft. And, part of me feels like, that was such a huge ordeal and victory and accomplishment, like that should be all that is required. And, currently, like really, the real challenge has only now just begun in some ways because, now I need to go through the publishing process. And so I'm getting my book out into the world so it can start having an impact. And so this involves, facing the inevitable criticism of my work, as well as having to sell other people on the value of my work, both of which are, giant nightmares, huge life lessons for me. Um, and so, there have been a lot of the kind of everyday tasks that I need to move forward that are really steps that I would prefer to avoid. Last night, for instance, I was doing some research on Amazon to see, what are some other books that have been written about polyamory. And so, at previous points in my life, just doing that would have prompted me to want to just quit the whole thing and to feel like, whatever I have done is totally worthless. Either it's already been done before or, somebody else has done it better. And I would feel very shut down. It would be hard to keep going. And so I was very pleasantly surprised last night to recognize, like, oh, okay, there's a lot of other things out there, and also my particular vantage point and my mission about writing it is really kind of filling multiple holes. And so I was definitely, needing to do some deep breathing through it, but ultimately, I was feeling excited. And so, I'm noticing that on the days when I allow myself to, in the name of self-care, avoid those things that are uncomfortable, then and instead to choose activities that feel less uncomfortable, that when I go to bed at night, then I tend to have kind of nagging feelings of guilt and shame. And these are different from, kind of the feelings of guilt and shame that come from the driver, the taskmaster in us that really believes that our worth is determined by our productivity. And so these feelings of guilt and shame were really coming from a different place, like a sense of feeling ill at ease with myself or feeling like, I had let myself down in some ways. And, this impacts my sense of worthiness and my sense of self-confidence, and especially my feelings of efficacy and empowerment. And so when I back down in the face of my fears, that it really undermines the ability that I have to feel like I have power to create change in my life. However, on the days when, I have determined to face my fears and to proceed with, the often unbearably uncomfortable tasks that I would prefer to avoid, even though there might be, hours of flailing around in the process of helping myself to settle down and to dive into it. At the end of the day, then I tend to feel really great. And so I feel a surge of joy and pride. I tend to feel in touch with my own sense of power. Um, and I feel a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. And, I create kind of energy and confidence that then I can carry into the next day and I can build on. And so this makes the next day actually a lot easier just to begin with. And so that is one of the ways that I know that it's self-loving, because my future self is grateful, because the opposite is also true. That's, when I tell myself that I'm depressed and I just don't have it in me today to face my fears and take steps forward, it tends to create a self-perpetuating cycle that drags me further down into the depression. And, that is an example of, really kind of like what we were doing culturally, basically being like, well, my future self is going to pay the price because then it makes the next day actually a lot harder. And so what I'm realizing now is that I am actually creating that experience. And so the things that I am doing to supposedly remedy and care for that depressed and hopeless part is actually creating more depression and hopelessness. And so when I step back from challenges during hard times in the name of self-care, then I actually spiral deeper. And so what has actually helped me to come out of it, kind of counterintuitively, is really, taking on specific challenges, such as my 30-day book writing challenge, which is how I got my book written, that require me to summon all of my energy and resolve and commitment, because that is what creates that sense of movement and that sense of agency, both of which are what is generally missing during those depressive times. And so even though, taking those steps might be very challenging in the moment, then I have found that doing so is actually self-loving, and it is actually self-care a lot more than just letting myself off the hook. And so welcome, Ace and Kai and Lori. Feel free to jump in if you have any questions or comments. I'm thinking about the ways that, pecking out of our self-imposed shells really does require some effort and determination. As I mentioned before, it is not a passive process. And so having some help and some encouragement during those overwhelming times can oftentimes really make the difference between breaking through the turbulence to get to the freedom of flight or feeling perpetually grounded and stuck. And so, especially if you feel like you're stuck in a downward spiral, and you're realizing perhaps the ways that you've been dealing with it actually might be making it worse, kind of like what I was realizing for myself, keeping you stuck, then reach out, send me a private message, and I can get you the same results that I get for my other clients. And so I can bust you through that gravitational pull of your limiting beliefs and get you to the ease and joy and confidence and accomplishment that can be found on the other side. And so, especially living in very uncertain times, we don't know how much time that we have here, and so life is too short to have less than our best life. And so, what are we waiting for? It's really the highest form of self-love. Is actually wanting more for ourselves, and then allowing ourselves to get the help that we need in order to be able to get there. So, hey, happy summer, y'all! Thanks for being with me. And if you have anything you want to add, then feel free to jump in now. I don't know why there's a weird line across my head. I'm not sure if that's showing up for you all as well. It's a little bit distracting. But I hope that you gained something from thoughts for tonight, and that your self-care is going well, and your self-care reflections are taking you to a place of your highest wisdom and empowerment. So anyhow, happy Monday, and have a great week, and I'll check in with you again soon.